Hi there, welcome. In this video, I want to talk about being the client who shows up to therapy or inner work with a lot of complex self-awareness, the client who understands themselves deeply, but yet nothing seems to change. This video is part of a series about the private inner work space, what to expect, and how to get the most out of it. So if you'd like to be notified when new videos are released, you can subscribe below. And if you don't know me, I'm Julia Verdal, and I help people transform unhelpful coping strategies at the root so you can build the life and the relationships and experiences that your deeper self really wants. I draw on Buddhist teachings, Western psychology, and nature-based wisdom, and I've been guiding people through the inner world for about 15 years. So let's talk about this particular kind of stuckness. Some clients or students come into the private inner work space with incredibly intricate self-awareness. They know their attachment style and their love language. They've read all the books. They know all about their maladaptive coping patterns and where they come from. They can explain exactly why they react the way they do and what goes on in their inner environment, right? They can articulate the source of their wounds clearly, and yet nothing is changing. The problem here is that awareness alone does not bring transformation. In fact, sometimes awareness can become yet another armor we put on to protect against change. It's a very intelligent form of defense, but the psyche can be tricky this way. There are plenty of parts within us that absolutely do want to change, but there are other parts that do not. So sometimes we can actually use our awareness and our intellect to shield ourselves against change instead of to help ourselves change. So with this kind of student, there are a few things that I would explore. The first is you understand your feelings, but are you actually feeling your feelings? Or are you analyzing them to avoid feeling them? You know, a lot of highly self-aware people stay in the intellect because it's a bit removed from the body where our feelings live, where our emotions live. The intellect can feel a lot safer than grief, safer than helplessness, safer than regret or rage or disappointment or longing. So intellectualizing creates a feeling of control where we're staying just on the perimeter uh, prior to actually feeling our feelings in the body. And most likely that distance was necessary to create at one point in your life. Perhaps your experience was exceeding your capacity, the nervous system capacity, or your capacity to feel. So it may be what your system has learned to do to get through something difficult and you're kind of stuck in that mode or that mechanism. But at some point, we want to move from intellectualizing to feeling, to facing our pain and our fear. Healing requires feeling. We have to feel our feelings in order to metabolize them and move forward. If you aren't feeling your feelings, it may mean that you don't feel safe enough to feel them yet. And so in that case, I would have us work on creating that safety as the first step, because that's when healing happens, when you feel safe enough to let your guard down and feel. The second thing I would explore with a student like this is whether there's an unconscious attachment to identity happening. Sometimes we become deeply identified with and attached to the story of our wounds or our patterns. So, for example, maybe part of you has become the anxious attacher or the avoidant one, or the person who understands trauma deeply but can't quite heal. Believe it or not, it can be scary to let go of these identities because then we're in the unknown. We don't know who we are, how to relate, or what to do with ourselves. It destabilizes the patterns in our relationships. So this is perfectly normal and quite common. Our identities give us continuity. They help us make sense of ourselves and they help us create connections. But an old identity that was formed before you had the consciousness to actually choose it is likely limiting and will keep you stuck. So sometimes we need to notice this and loosen our grip on a story or identity, one thread at a time. Sometimes people fear healing and change more than they realize because healing puts them in unknown territory about who they are. And the third thing I would explore is actually the relational dynamic happening in the space with me. So sometimes a student is technically talking to me, but they're not actually letting me in. They're reporting or explaining and sometimes performing. But along the way, they're remaining emotionally alone. So I would look for an opportunity to express curiosity about that. I might gently inquire if it feels risky to allow someone to see you or support you. Maybe you learned very early that no one could really help. Maybe relying on others felt actually dangerous and disappointment was imminent. Maybe vulnerability led to shame or betrayal or abandonment. There are many possibilities to explore there. There are many reasons why a person might avoid letting their guide or therapist in. And so in this case, gently calling that out might be precisely where the medicine is. Recognizing this and working on it together over time may be the thing that breaks the cycle. It's really important to understand that all of our psychological and emotional wounds are relational. That is why most of them must be healed in relationship, right? We can do a lot of work ourselves, but sometimes that's a path that also has its own kind of dead end because we never learn to let someone else in. So if some of what I'm describing in this video sounds familiar to you, you might also watch my video on hyperindependence. There's a link to that video in the description. Now, to be clear, complex self-awareness is not a problem, it's a strength. But as I said, it can be used as a shield, in which case it won't help you. At some point, we have to move beyond awareness of self to the experience of self, to feeling, relating, being cared for, and letting go of some control. And that can be scary, but it's likely the way through. So if you recognize yourself in this tendency to be highly self-aware while struggling to change what you want to change, or struggling to meet your inner work aspirations, if you set aspirations as I do with my students, I would be curious to hear what you think or what has worked for you. So please feel free to share that in the comments. Thank you as always for being here. And if you're looking for support in your own inner work, you can find more information about the work that I do in the video description below. Thank you.